All right, so you look at this, right? It's like day 1, day 21, okay? And so the first thing is the number one error with the whole training program. This is true for a 142 training program. This is true for a 121 training program. Everybody shows up to day 1 with zero preparation. And usually this has actually happened a couple times. They're like, oh, I just landed my citation last night and I'm starting day 1 of ground school right now. And so a lot of times these training programs are not designed to teach you the exacts of the airplane. They're there to teach you how to fly it that company's way. So the best thing is you can prepare yourself beforehand and then come into the training program. So there's this little part right here, and I have it highlighted in red. This area right here, highlighted in red, you go through all this ground school, you go through fixed base and motion sim, and that part is an area that brings trouble in training since you have to combine oral and sim prep topics together. And you got to realize too that you have 2 different checking events. You have an oral highlighted here in green, and you got your check right at the end, right? So the oral, what am I studying for the oral? Memory items, limitations, lights and switches. Okay, everybody who's flown jet before pretty much knows that. What are you studying for the check ride? Well, it's going to change. Over at the check ride, look at the different things that you need to be assessed on. Aircraft control, call-outs, SOPs, procedures, profiles, stick and rudder. And all these things that are assessed here are not assessed here. And as a result of that, what ends up happening here in fixed base is you get an internal battle where you're not sure if you should be following or studying memory items, limitations, lights and switches, or if you should be studying the other things at the end. And so what we see in training is basically this. You go through all this ground school, okay? And by the way, okay, here's what's going to happen too when you show up to day 1. They give you a stack of 20,000 pages, all these manuals, and they say, good luck, we're all counting on you, right? But they don't actually tell you what exactly to study and where you need to get it from.
We see that all the time.
So, yeah, so the first thing, so like, it's like, oh, you have 21 days to learn an airplane that was made after 21 years. Yeah. And recite everything to proficiency, right? And so it's like, basically what we're saying is climb a 10-story building and here's your ladder. But the question is, what are the steps on these ladders, okay? So that we can climb this 10-story building successfully, right? So step 1, of course, you got to pass an oral. Okay, now the oral consists of memory items, okay, limitations, lights and switches. Okay, so now that you know that, out of all those 20,000 pages that you have, where do I get each one of these things? The limitations would also be found in FCOM Volume 1. The memory items, by the way, can also be found in the QRH, and the lights and switches would be FCOM Volume 2. So when we do training, like here, for example, what we're saying is, here's where I need you to go, and here's exactly how you're going to get there. And furthermore, here's where you can find it, and then we'll give like assignments and stuff like that. Study this on day 1, study this on day 2, which is something that unfortunately is not found often.
We just go in detail exactly how to study. Every day, we just go over stuff. Because that's one of the biggest problems that we see all the time. And they already have all the materials, huh? Maybe like 3 weeks before, a month before. And then they get to class and you already know your limitation. Do you know your memory? What are you talking about?
Yeah.
They didn't tell me none of this. So if you have time, take the advantage to learn limitation and memory item, because this is time reduction once we start. Because once we start, there's no time.
Yeah.
You see? Because we have to go through the whole system in 5 days.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, or 6 days.
Digital will get a massive impact on that.
It's incredible.
So many people are to go and sit in line to print it all on paper.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Especially when you get an iPad and it revises and it wipes out all your bookmarks.
And so look at this for a second, right? Because you go through all this, you're going through ground school, you're thinking, man, I'm doing really good, everything's cool, I'm happy, right? And then all of a sudden you get to fixed base, and it's like, wait a minute, I got to know flows, I got to know how to load a box, right? FMS McDo, I got to know how to do a holding procedure, I got to do all these things, and you still haven't done an oral. And you're like, so what do I study now? Because you're starting to get task saturated with all the different things you need to go through. And this is where people are trying to have like learning plateaus because they're not sure what they need to be going through. And so this is why I make it evident to everybody. Like on day 1 of class, I'm like, okay, look, number 1, this is your timeline. Number 2, you're going to have probably an issue right here. I'm just going to make you aware of it before you have the battle by yourself internally. I'm going to tell you what the battle is coming up. And the second part is, how do I deal with that? Well, if you don't pass an oral, you don't go to a full motion sim. So let's just start with that. So I always provide these little pie charts over here, right? And I'm like, well, how would I allocate time effectively? And so I would say 40% systems, 30 memory items, 30 limitations. And this may change. This may not always be like that. Right. You may it all depends on how you're progressing. Right. But prior to initiating ground school, this is pretty much what I would be looking at. During ground school, I would also be looking at that. And the way that I usually study, everybody has their own method, but I tend to study what I like to call study backwards. So like on day 1, let's say we go through electric, hydraulic, pneumatic. And then on day 2, we do pressurization and air conditioning. And then on day 3, we do flight controls and we do fire protection. So what I'll do is I'll actually study, I'll prepare slightly for this day, right? Prepare for that. The next day, when we cover the next thing, I'm actually going to go home that night. I'm going to study what we covered there, and I'm going to study backwards. And I'm going to go through what we studied the day prior. Because what ends up happening is here you're sharp on what you covered, here you're sharp on what you covered, but by the time you get to the oral, you may have forgotten from day 1, which is why I like to go backwards and restudy everything as I'm going. Yeah. So, number 1 mistake, starting the training program. They show up thinking the training program is going to show everything. Okay? Put the time in and the effort and everything on your own. And the funniest thing is, you show up for training and you think you're going to get trained. And instead, you end up getting checked, right? So it's like, hey, show up for training event number 2, right? Full motion sim. Let's say over here, full motion sim training events coming tomorrow. And instead, what ends up happening is you go to the training event and you end up getting checked. And you feel like every day you're going to a check ride instead of going to a training event. This happens time and time and time again. And so this is one thing, like for instructors. And we have like a couple guys. If Juan and I can't teach the class, we have 2 guys that can come in here and teach. But we try as much as we can to be here because of the quality of the content being delivered. And we don't want to devalue the brand and anything like that. But one of the things I tell these guys is like, look, these people come here and they pay. If they come here and you're doing all the asking and you're using the PowerPoint and you're not actually saying anything, then they might as well walk out because they're wasting their money, you're wasting their time, and it's just a loss for everybody. So training is training and checking is checking. As far as I'm concerned, there's 2 checking events. You have an oral and you have a check ride. Everything in between should be training. It should not be checking. And what I see happening more and more, time and time again, is that you show up to a training event and you end up getting checked. And so what does that tell you? It's basically self-study is prevalent. That's what's happening. There's this mentality, this thought that if I'm a 40-year pilot and I've been flying for the last 40 years, I'm the best instructor. And teaching and flying an airplane is 2 totally different things. And so that's not necessarily the case. The other thing is there's 2 parts. Like what's funny about the oral and the check ride is that on the oral, you're being quizzed on how the airplane operates, whereas in the real world of flying, you're operating the airplane. So it's a little bit different. You're not necessarily teaching or learning how the airplane operates. You're always looking at how to operate the aircraft. So the guys, for example, that teach descent planning, how do I enter a traffic pattern doing 250 knots if I come on downwind, turn base and final, or if they give me some type of restriction, some constraint that's kind of unreasonable for me to comply with, how do I configure the aircraft's energy in order to put me in a position that I'm stable by 1,000 feet, centered on the localizer, glide slope, etc. So that type of instruction comes great from somebody who's been out there doing it for a while. And then you have the instruction like what Juan does, which is when I put the isolation valve in the auto position, when does it open? And when the corner switches go off in the 737, what does the auto logic say on the A320? Basically the AP bleed air comes on, the isolation valve opens, all these different things. And that really comes more from the teaching perspective of systems in the classroom. So this is the timeline. This is in the playbook. Do you have the playbook? I'm going to send it to you.
No, I don't.
Okay. Hey, we already started, man. What are you talking about? I'm live on the camera right now. They're watching me on YouTube, man. Huh? Yeah. I mean, if you can make it, start driving if you can. All right. No, man. 10 o'clock, bro. Come on. All right. You're on the camera, man. I'm going to put you on speaker. You want to say hi? I got the microphone right here. No, okay, all right, bye. Flight director tracking. Let's talk about this, good and bad. I'm going to mail you this whole thing so that you have this. It's 60 pages long. It has a bunch of good stuff in here. FD tracking, right? Good and bad. One of the things people realize, single engine, I just did a video about this actually yesterday. The flight director, unfortunately on the aircraft display, on the primary flight display, your attitude indicator, it's not that big. And this is of extreme importance. So further, there's 2 parts to this, right? The first one is, this is a good flight. What's the difference between that one and that one? Well, obviously on that one, it's not a perfect 4 squares because you have these, it's divided in 4, but it's uneven. And this is not very easy to see because the display is so small.
Generally, you only see that with the autopilot.
And There you go. Yeah, man. That's it. And so then you end up with, so let me show you what it kind of looks like. I'm going to draw it big so you can see it back there. But you end up with what you see on the bad side. You end up with maybe something that looks like that. And you think you're right on it. You think you're right on it, and you end up actually not being on it. And when you're out on a localizer far away, like out here, that may not be a problem, but once you get in here, that small little deviation like that is going to be a huge problem. And the other thing is, of course, as let me pull up an image that I have here.
The picture, yeah.
Yeah, that talks about speed reduction and varying rudder change. Right here. Right. So here, what I'm illustrating is like you have a more effective rudder. Any flight control surface, the higher the speed that is flowing over the flight control surface, right? So if I have 210 knots going over the rudder, it's a more effective rudder. I would need less of the rudder. Whereas if I have a lesser speed, 145 knots, it's less effective, more rudder required. And what happens is when you're on the approach, right? Let's say this is your runway, that's the final approach fix, and you do a config change here with flaps, you do another config change, maybe here you drop your gear, right? As you start heading this direction, you have a speed reduction, and of course with the speed reduction, you end up having a less effective rudder. And what happens is the config change happens, the rudder adjustment does not happen, and then you end up tracking a flight director poorly as a result of not adjusting that rudder pressure, right? And so now you go from a perfect flight director tracking to having the speed reduction, a need for adjustment that doesn't actually happen. You end up with a poor flight director tracking, and therefore when you get close on the ILS, you start having full scale deflections back and forth. And so the main thing with the flight director is like proactive tracking too, and not reactive tracking. And there's a lot of lazy like flight director tracking where you, oh, I see it swing right, I'm going to just follow it to the right instead of anticipating which way it's going to go. The other thing, let me use this marker here. Okay, the other thing is that people think that the flight director is like an old school HSI or VOR indication on, like, say, a 172, where they're used to, especially for the guys that are coming with low experience and they have, you know, this little setup like this where they got the needle swinging up, down, left, right.
I've actually heard people say, is it like an old OBS?
Yeah,
no.
That's not what it is. Yeah, that's not what it is. And so so let me illustrate something here. If your flight director, let's say your runway is here, okay, this is your localizer here. If you're over here, okay, on your, if this was an old school OBS or an HSI, right, what we would expect to see is a deviation off to the right like that. So it's basically saying, hey, fly to the right. In your flight director, of course, what it's also going to say is fly to the right. Okay, now the issue is that this bar is telling you the direction to turn in order to rejoin. It's giving you the guidance in order to rejoin, but it's not actually the localizer. This is not the localizer. This is only the guidance that is being provided to you and saying, hey, you need to turn to that heading to rejoin it. I think a lot of people think that this is a localizer and this is sort of a glide slope indication, and that's not the fact, right? The fact of the matter is you have an MCP or an FCU, which is simply put a way to integrate yourself with the automation, right? Like if I push heading select, this bar is now going to give me heading. If I push LNAV, it's now going to give me LNAV. If I push log, it gives me log. And so whatever guidance you want the flight director bar to give you, you give it that command from the MCP or the FCU, and then it's going to give you the appropriate guidance for you to rejoin the desired path. This is guidance. The flight director is guidance to rejoin the desired path or to fly and maintain the desired path. It's not actually a localizer and glide slope. And so you, of course, would know that because you've been flying a long time. But a lot of times what we end up seeing in the sim is people say, hey, I'm tracking the flight director, but yet I'm still not on the localizer. And so my first part is you're actually not tracking the flight director. You think you are, but you're not because you have a deviation problem that's going on because of what we just saw. And the other part is just because you think you're tracking it, that doesn't necessarily mean if you are tight here on this localizer and you're swinging back and forth like this, right, it could be saying, hey, fly left, fly right, fly left, fly right, and you could track it perfectly and you're perfectly going left and right. You're not actually on the localizer, okay? You're perfectly going left and right for those of you watching, okay? So that's the thing. What you see on the flight director is guidance to fly or rejoin a desired path. It's not necessarily a localizer and a glide slope indication. And that's a big confusion. More so with like the low time pilots that they've never flown with a flight director in their life, So, what else? Let me scroll back up here. V1 cut. That's the illustration I use for the V1 cut stuff, which is basically fly through the goalpost. Yeah, I tell everybody, fly through the goalpost. Why do I want to fly through the goalpost? Well, because PTS standard says 10 degrees left and right. And the V1 cut, by the way, is like not even everybody dreads the V1 cut, but the fact of the matter is the V1 cut is not even the area that has the most problems for people. It's usually a single engine ILS and the single engine go around.
Yeah.
And the single engine ILS is a problem because of the bad flight director tracking. The single engine go around becomes a problem because there's no visual reference to anything. Your IMC, you apply power, which requires a rudder application, and they end up not having visual reference to a center line, and therefore they end up screwing up the plus or minus 10 degrees. So what I'm always saying, I'll talk about the V1 cut, and then I'll go to the go-around situation. So with the V1 cut, I always say, number one, delay rotation slightly. Number two, parallel the center line. And the reason I say parallel the center line is because if you think about, at the very least, if you could get on the center line, that's ideal. But at the very least, you need to be parallel. And the reason I say this is because think about, for example, like if this engine, number one, failed, and you applied zero rudder. If this is left rudder, right rudder down here. If you applied no rudder, what would end up happening to the airplane? It would track off to the left, right? So it's going to go this way. Okay, hopefully you correct it before you go off into the grass.
Mine would be greater radius than what you
Oh,
just.
yeah.
Oh yeah, it'd be like,
Especially what you're flying.
yeah, you know, and and here's another thing too. It's like for people that are corporate, coming from Gulfstream, coming from Learjet, coming from Hawker, anything that's centerline thrust. Remember, now you have your engine out here as opposed to having that centerline thrust where the engine was right here on the tail.
Yeah, I think a lot of times they still underestimate.
Yeah.
Centerline thrust.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, what you're flying as Neos now, that's a lot of airflow.
Yeah.
Even more dramatic, but they tend to underestimate what centerline thrust is gonna.
It's going to affect. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely they do. Absolutely they do. And so like with this, I say, look, let's just say for a second, okay, that I didn't apply any rudder pressure. Okay, the airplane's going to go off, right? And now all of a sudden you realize, oh shoot, I'm going off the runway. Let me start applying some rudder. So you start adding some rudder, and in this case, we're going to step on the live engine, which is the number two, right? So you got the left and the right pedal. So how much rudder pressure is it going to take for me to stop that and just go straight? I don't know. Maybe it's 5 pounds, 10 pounds. Don't know. Don't care. It's kind of irrelevant. We don't have a pressure sensor down there. But the main thing is this: realize that for 5 pounds.
On the Airbus, you sure?
Yeah, I know, right? On the Airbus, we have everything.
It's being recorded.
So, let me rephrase it. We don't have a pressure sensor that the pilots can see. So let's say that's the case, okay? And maybe it's 5'10", it's kind of irrelevant. But the point is, for me to get back onto the center line, it would require more than 5 pounds. So let's say to get back on it, it requires 8 pounds, and that's going to give me a right track back onto the center line. And the issue is people will correct back, and they'll apply all this rudder pressure to get back. And when they finally do get back, they don't readjust back to 5 in order to continue on the center line. Now, the fact of the matter is I'm using 5 and 8, and the truth is that even those numbers would change. Not because those are not the correct numbers, but because as you're accelerating down the runway, your airflow happens to increase, your rudder begins to get more effective, and the numbers are constantly changing because with the speed increase, the rudder is more effective, which means varying pressure. And so people start playing bicycle on the runway with the V1 cut. Instead of just paralleling it, maintain visual, and then V1, and then when they get to the rotation, just rotate it off smoothly. And that's what ends up happening. Now, finally, when you do get the gist of this, you get the hang of this, and what I actually do in the simulator is I'll intentionally make it visual. I'll fail the engine at 80 knots, and I'll intentionally say, this is just an exercise, okay, continue down the runway and parallel the center line with your rudder pedals. Right, so we get to 80, engine failure, continue, right? And then I parallel the center line. I just want you to get the muscle memory on your leg, what it feels like, what it looks like. And then later on, what I'll end up doing is dropping the weather, and then I'll slowly start to fail the engine closer to V1, closer to V1, closer to V1, so you see what it's supposed to look like. But the issue is that the go-around is one of the number one areas of additional training because of the lack of center line reference, as opposed to the V1 cut. Like V1 cut, you can see the center line on the go-around.
Just to reinforce what you're saying, the last evolutions I've been involved with,
Yeah.
the assumption that's excellent training, even though I've been doing this a long time. Nobody does it anymore. What you just described, to go down there and make them track the center line.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that's not what's
No.
being done.
No.
That's why you guys are right where you need to be.
Yeah. Man, we appreciate the vote of confidence. We're pushing, man.
Don't want to feel like a kid looking at Facebook, here's Joe wanting.
Let's play to see what they got.
Whatever. That's why. I mean, every day we put something out, man. All right, cool. So let me talk about Kennedy Airport training, type rating training. Almost always, depending on how the sim's programmed. Yep.
And the circling. You have to do circling approach.
Yep. So you end up doing one of two departures out of Kennedy. It's either the JFK, I think it's called the 4, or you do the score 4 departure. No, this is Kennedy 5 now, they changed it. Kennedy 5 or the score 4 departure, which is all off of 31 left, basically a climbing left turn, brings you to Canarsie, and then you go out to Ranger, which is over here. The bottom line is, even if you do this, or you go the other way, which would be score, if you did the score, Canarsie is basically replaced by score, and then there's two options. You can go out this direction or that direction. You can go to Ranger or you can go to Yankee, one of the two. And the whole thing with this is it works out perfectly to put you right back in the pattern for the 4s, because 4 right is right over here and 4 left parallels that. So as soon as you launch into this pattern, it's very efficient training-wise to bring you right back in for an ILS into one of these runways. Usually the first thing that's going to happen out here as you're on this heading, okay, right here you're going to get some type of TCAS event, and it's generally a TCAS RA. Okay, the main thing here is that when it says traffic, you end up doing nothing until the point where it says climb or descend. And a lot of times people get jumpy, and as soon as they hear the traffic, they disconnect the stuff. And so you want to just relax. When it gives you the climb or the descend, then you go ahead and comply with it. The other issue is that people forget to advise ATC. They get so caught up in flying out of the no-fly zone on the PFD or on the vertical speed indicator, however your aircraft happens to present it, and they end up not calling ATC to advise them of the deviation of altitude. So that's another big issue with that. Usually from here, we end up getting into the airwork on the similar heading, and the airwork is going to consist of steep turns. All right, then you have your stalls, and you got your unusual attitudes. I'm going to give you something with the Airbus. Okay, so for example, the stalls. In order to simulate in the Airbus, in theory, you can't stall. Normal law. All right, that's what they say. Okay, so you got to get into alternate law. Okay, now in alternate law, there's a couple different ways that the instructor is going to put you in alternate law. The first one is you're in a modern sim, and there's actually a push button that says alternate law demonstration. And by pushing that, you're going to put yourself in alternate law. Everything works out perfectly. The other way that you could get into alternate law is by, yeah.
Reach up and pull a bunch of circuit breakers.
Yeah, reach up and pull a bunch of stuff. You listening? Pull a bunch of circuit breakers. Okay. All right, so here's normally what they'll do is they'll turn off ADR number 1, number 2, and they'll put captain on 3. You know you have a switching panel over here. With ADR 1 and 3, so these give speed input to the landing gear. And above 260 plus knots, okay, indicated airspeed, the gear actually will not come down. So if you were to lose these two, you would actually have a procedure that would call for manual gear extension. You would have to go and manually extend the gear, because upon gear selection down, it won't actually come down. Yeah, and the reason it won't come down, of course, is because why? Well, it doesn't know if it's safe because it doesn't have a speed input, because number 1 and number 2, or number 1 and number 3 have failed, right? So this is why when we do an alternate law simulation, we actually fail number 1 and we fail number 2, so that we can still keep number 3 to give me a speed input to allow me to put the gear down so that I can actually put you into direct law later on to simulate the stall in direct law. Make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, yeah, that's kind of the deal with that. So when you're in the sim, I'm going to be running your sim anyways when we're doing the type rating, so it won't matter. But when we're doing the sim, and maybe later on at your company when you do the sim, and he's going to say, okay, we're going to do the stall series, and you're somewhere out here on a southwesterly heading and you're doing your stalls, he's probably going to either hit the button if it's a new sim, and if it's not, he's going to reach up to the ADRs, he'll turn off number 1, number 2, and then he'll go to the switching panel and put you on number 3. That's the way they run that. So, cool. So once we do the steep turns, we do the stalls.
Switching at that point would be pilot induced anyway, but once you went to the
Right. Right.
it would tell you to take it.
Right. It would. Yeah, it sure would. Then they'll bring you in, you'll do an ILS approach 4 right. Usually from here you're going to go around, and you'll come back.
You have to lose an engine.
Okay. Yep. And the engine failure is coming here in a minute. So you'll do the go around. Now, depending on where you're at.
Don't give me any ideas, Juan.
Okay. So at an airline, you would do an ILS. you would go around and come back and do a straight-in non-precision approach, probably going to be a localizer or going to be an RNAV approach, something like that. At a training center, we'll actually do a non-precision to a circle. So you're going to get down here to runway 4 right. Okay, in Kennedy, they always do one circling. It's a non-precision approach to runway 4 right, and then circle around and land on runway 31 right. This is the way they do it every time. At an airline, you'll notice maybe on your license, you actually have a type rating that says circling restriction. You have all those.
I think I have one that does it.
Now in the Airbus, it's extremely easy to do the circling because there is no guesswork. The reason I say that is because like on the 7.3, for example, you make a right turn, you make a heading of 100, and then you have to time approximately 30 seconds, which is basically the radial 176 coming off of Kennedy. You do all these different little gimmicks to try to make the thing work. But in the Airbus, it's very simple because you have 2 flight plans. You have a primary and a secondary. Yeah, so what we do in the secondary is we just load up 31 right, we put an extended center line, and then what we'll end up doing is when we get 1.6 miles lateral distance from the extended center line, then we just make a right turn to 31 right. You always roll out. If you do this turn at 1.6 miles, you always roll out straight on to 31 right. And you can end up coming in and making a smooth approach and landing.
The beauty of the 7.3 was all the place bearing distance. It made it so fast and easy
Yeah.
to extend the center line.
Yeah. So, so that's basically it with that. Off of 31 right, one of two things is going to happen. You're going to land, or you're going to do a rejected landing, which basically means you go below 50 feet and then you do the go around. The main thing with this is go left on this go around.
Don't
and
go right.
do not
Don't
go,
go right. Don't
yeah,
go
so it's a left turn, heading 100 to rejoin the 4 right. So when you're doing any circling approach, you need to brief 2 missed approaches. What if I get to the bottom of 4 right here and I don't see this runway? What if at any point in the circling I don't see the runway? And so this is what your examiner is going to be looking for, is that you brief 2 different missed approaches. I get to the bottom of the initial runway that I conducted the approach to, I don't see it, and at some point in the circling I have to conduct a go around. So the second briefing is the one that usually people mess up because it's not actually written anywhere. If I get down in the minimums of 4 right and I don't see it, then I'm just going to follow the publish and you read it off the plate. And the second one, usually people get a little mixed up because it's not actually written anywhere. So the main thing is, what am I going to do? I'm going to turn in the protected area, which is over the airport, and you're basically going to make a left turn to comply with the missed approach from the what's published for the initial runway that we made that approach to. So 100 degrees on the heading, then we're going to track basically outbound, go to Deer Park. There's a holdout here in Deer Park. So all these different things, when you go to your training center, and it sounds like I'm actually going to be your instructor anyways, we would end up briefing this in detail. But the bottom line is that, yeah, what I've seen sometimes happen is people will take off, and what happens is on the Airbus, for example, likewise on the NG, it's going to engage nav mode as soon as you go around flaps, right? Flaps come up, positive rate gear up.
You know why I'm laughing? If people knew how much they can get out of us teaching all this stuff, man, it's
Well,
like,
I mean, like
how can you go wrong going with Joe to the center?
the little bit-
It's telling you every
The
detail.
little bit that we've sat here,
It's like,
you don't even get that in a full program.
oh, no.
No, you don't.
No. Imagine doing all this on the ground, on the briefing room, and then you're gonna do it in the same way,
Yeah.
in detail.
Let me tell you,
So it's like,
Yeah.
this is gold, my God.
Yeah, it is.
Gold.
It is.
yeah,
And they don't realize.
and I'm going quick.
And they don't
I'm running
realize-
quick.
Right, in the sim is
But
more slow.
that the reason people get trapped with the circling, and again, when we go through your training program, I'm going to rebrief this again, but when you go around here, okay, the flight director is looking for the shortest distance to rejoin the missed approach, the published, right? So the shortest distance would be to turn that way because the line comes out like this, as opposed to going all the way that way. So if you get up here and you don't pull heading and do this, and you actually just you track the flight director blindly to the right,
Yeah.
you end up turning right. And then usually right about here, the sim ends up frozen, and the examiner says, you turned the wrong way, you failed. And that's the end of it. You know what I mean? And so sometimes I brief this and we'll go into the sim and then they'll still end up turning the wrong way because in the heat of the battle, everything sounds great
Yeah.
here, but in the heat of the battle, you forget these things, and I understand that too. Everything sounds great while you're here, and then when you get in there, it's a little bit of a different story, but that is a huge hang up right there, and that gets people big time. Once you do the hold, you're going to enter the hold. The main thing in the hold is PTA, position, time, altitude.
Yeah.
So when you hit the holding pattern, there's 3 things. You got to tell them, hey, trainer 1, we're entering the hold at Deer Park, time, whatever's on the clock here, the altitude 3,000 feet. And so people miss the announcement. The other thing that people miss is the fact that the holding speed below 6,000 feet in the US is 200 knots.
Yeah.
So you might go into the hold doing
I
210,
always
220. Yeah, get speed relief in the hold. And then after that, they'll bring you back in for another non-precision approach. You'll land, and then you go into your single engine stuff. And so usually with the single engine stuff, the first thing, when you get into the single engine operation, the first thing that you're going to do is the rejected takeoff, the RTO. The reason the RTO happens first is because the way the box works is if you load the McDo, in the Airbus case, load the McDo, as long as you don't leave the ground in the sim, the McDo will remain loaded. The second you leave the ground and then reposition back onto the sim, whatever you loaded there gets dumped. So
Even in the sim.
Even in the sim.
Wow.
Yep. So
that's why the sim is excellent for training, but on the line, no.
So-
the sim, it's good because it makes you practice all the time.
yeah, and what I try to do is I take a snapshot of the box, so that I don't have to have them loaded. Like I'll save it. There's a little thing to save it, but some sims are old. They don't have a snapshot feature. Munoz, OneStepPrep.com. Hey, do I have your attention yet? If not, what if I juggle these coffee cups and answer oral questions at the same time? Hey, Juan, come in here and ask me a couple oral questions real quick. No, come in while I'm doing this. Okay, look, we're not going to do that. But if you do come here and train in person with us, the coffee is free. Engine starting, potable water system pressurization, hydraulic reservoir pressurization. Well, a flight control law is a set of rules by which to govern flight controls. Of attack protection, including stall protection, including roll protection. A bird strike comes straight through your engine, right in, and then next thing you know, you find yourself single engine.
Nosotros podemos llamar a alguien para que nos responda esta pregunta.
Que le debería dar a sus examinadores que